She said I should fail, but that night, I asked her to teach me something far more dangerous than lessons. The classroom was unusually quiet once everyone had left. Desks sat in neat rows like silent witnesses, and the faint scent of chalk and old paper still lingered in the air. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall windows, stretching shadows across the floor, and for a moment I felt as though I was the only one left in the world. But I wasn't. She was still there, standing at her desk, posture straight, expression unreadable. Her name carried weight in the halls, respected by students and colleagues alike. She wasn't the kind of teacher anyone argued with, not because of fear, but because she had a way of commanding attention without ever raising her voice. At 42, she carried herself with the grace of someone who had learned not just from books, but from life itself. Her presence filled the room as effortlessly as the fading light. She held a stack of papers in her hand, and with every slow turn of the pages, I felt my chest tighten. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were steady, sharp, yet softened at the edges with something I couldn't name. "You know I should fail you," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a gravity that pressed against me. The words cut deeper than I expected. I wasn't a stranger to hard truths, but coming from her, they stung in a way that made my throat dry. For a second, I looked down at my desk, tracing the faint scratches in the wood as if the lines might offer me answers. But I forced myself to look back up, into her eyes, and what I saw there wasn't cruelty. It was disappointment, and beneath that, something like hesitation. She sighed quietly, closing the grade book with deliberate care. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the empty room. "You've got potential," she continued, "but potential doesn't pass exams. Effort does. Discipline does." Her gaze flicked over me again, as if measuring whether I could carry the weight of her words. I wanted to defend myself, to explain the late nights, the scattered focus, the things I hadn't told anyone else. But her expression held me still, stern, yes, but not without compassion. There was a pause, a silence filled with everything neither of us dared to say. The dust floating in the golden light seemed suspended in that moment, waiting. Her words were meant to end the conversation, but instead, they sparked something inside me, not just fear of failing, but the quiet, stubborn urge to prove myself to her. The room had emptied hours ago, yet it felt as if time had slowed to a standstill. Outside the windows, the light had shifted from golden to muted gray, leaving the classroom bathed in long shadows. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the old ceiling fan. She stood by her desk, arms folded, the faintest crease between her brows as she glanced down at the grade book again. I watched her carefully, searching for some sign that she hadn't made up her mind completely. Her voice still echoed in my head, "You know I should fail you." The truth of it was undeniable, yet the thought of walking out and never having the chance to prove myself gnawed at me. Something in her tone earlier hadn't been final. It had been firm, yes, but not merciless. And it was that hesitation I clung to. I leaned forward, my voice low, almost breaking the silence rather than disturbing it. "Then, teach me after class." The word slipped out with a quiet urgency I hadn't planned, not sharp, not rebellious, but pleading, almost fragile. For a heartbeat, I thought she might laugh at the audacity, dismiss me with a wave of her hand. But she didn't. She froze. Her pen stilled against the page, her posture rigid. Slowly, she looked up, and in the half-light, her eyes seemed darker, their depth unreadable. "Do you know what you're asking?" she whispered, and though the question sounded like reproach, there was something else buried in her tone, a tremor she tried to hide. I held her gaze, steady despite the rapid thrum of my pulse. "I'm asking for a chance. Nothing more." Her lips parted, as if words had formed and then died unspoken. She drew in a breath, smoothed the edge of her scarf with nervous fingers, and turned slightly toward the window. The faint glow outside outlined her profile in soft silver, and for the first time, I caught the smallest trace of uncertainty in her. Her silence lingered like a fragile thread between us. The weight of it pressed against me, yet it wasn't rejection. It was consideration. She closed the grade book with deliberate care, setting it aside, though her eyes refused to meet mine. After class, she said at last, almost to herself, the words barely audible. It wasn't permission spoken aloud, not yet. But it wasn't refusal either. And in that fragile pause, I realized something had shifted, not just in her decision, but between us. The walls of the classroom suddenly felt closer, the air heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't name. The first time I returned after class, the building felt like a different world. The usual chatter of students had long since faded, and the corridors were hushed, carrying only the faint echo of my footsteps. When I stepped into the classroom, the sun had already slipped below the horizon, leaving the room in a dim half-light. A single desk lamp glowed on her table, its amber circle of light casting long, soft shadows across the walls. She sat waiting, her glasses perched low on her nose, papers neatly stacked beside her. The sharp authority she carried during the day seemed quieter now, almost softened by the hour. Still, she didn't look up immediately, as if keeping a deliberate distance until she decided what tone this, after class, would take. "Sit," she said simply, her voice steady but low. I obeyed, pulling the chair closer to her desk. The room smelled faintly of ink, old books, and the delicate trace of her perfume, subtle but impossible to ignore. She handed me a notebook and leaned in slightly, pointing at a line I'd miscalculated earlier that week. Her hand brushed mine as she guided the pen, and though the touch lasted no longer than a heartbeat, it carried a weight that stole the breath from my chest. I glanced up at her, but her expression gave nothing away, focused, professional, though her lashes lowered a second too long before she pulled back. We worked quietly for a while. Equations turned into explanations, explanations into stories. She didn't just tell me how to solve problems, she spoke of discipline, of persistence, of the times in her own life when she had failed and started again. Her words weren't just lessons in ink and numbers, they were fragments of herself she was allowing me to glimpse. I listened, not only to her voice but to the pauses between her sentences, the subtle hesitations, the sighs she thought I didn't hear. Each pause made her feel less like the untouchable figure at the front of the classroom and more like someone carrying burdens I hadn't imagined. When she finally leaned back, her fingers brushed against a loose strand of hair that had fallen near her cheek. Without thinking, I noticed the way the lamplight kissed the curve of her face, highlighting both strength and quiet weariness. The night carried on, and though we filled pages with ink, what lingered was not the work itself. It was the warmth of her presence, the gravity of sitting close enough to feel the subtle rhythm of her breath, and the undeniable awareness that these lessons were no longer just about passing a class. Something far deeper had begun. Rain had begun to fall by the time our next lesson stretched into the evening. The windows trembled softly under the patter, each drop streaking down like a secret trying to escape. The classroom was dim, lit only by the same desk lamp that had become our quiet companion. Its glow spilled across scattered papers, her handwriting looping neatly in the margins. She sat across from me, shoulders slightly hunched, her cardigan wrapped tight around her frame as though the chill in the air was more than just weather. For the first time since these lessons began, she seemed distracted, her gaze drifting to the rain-streaked glass instead of the page between us. "You're improving," she said after a pause, though her tone lacked the usual conviction. "If you keep this up, you'll pass." The words should have carried pride, maybe relief, but instead they felt heavy, as though she was forcing them out. I studied her face, the faint tension at the corners of her mouth, the crease forming between her brows. It wasn't about the work. Something else lingered just beneath the surface. "You don't sound happy about that," I said softly. Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp for an instant, then softened. She exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the pen in her hand. "It's not that," she admitted, her voice low, almost drowned by the rain. "It's just, sometimes I wonder what I'm doing. Whether this is fair to either of us." Her words cut through me, not because of doubt in my ability, but because of the fear laced in them. She wasn't questioning my effort, she was questioning herself. "Fair?" I asked, leaning forward. She gave a small, almost self-conscious laugh, though it held no humor. People notice things. They talk. I'm your teacher. She trailed off, shaking her head as if she'd already said too much. The silence that followed was fragile, fragile enough to break with a single word. I could see it, the battle within her, between the rules that shaped her life and the quiet longing she couldn't admit. Without thinking, I reached across the desk and laid my hand gently over hers. Her fingers were cold, trembling faintly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes lifted to mine, and in them I saw a vulnerability that stripped away every layer of distance she had tried to keep. Her lips parted, as though she might tell me to stop, but no sound came. For a long moment, the rain was the only voice in the room. And in that silence, something unspoken connected us, fragile, dangerous, and undeniable. The rain had stopped by the next evening, leaving the world outside damp and heavy with the scent of earth. The classroom felt warmer, though perhaps it was only me, or the way she leaned closer as she explained another problem, her voice steady but softer than usual. The desk lamp cast a golden glow over her, highlighting the smooth line of her jaw, the gentle curve of her lips as she spoke. I tried to focus on the notebook between us, but my attention betrayed me. It lingered on the way her hand brushed across the page, the faintest tremor when her fingers neared mine. She leaned closer, close enough that I could see the faint outline of tiredness beneath her eyes, close enough that her breath, faintly laced with mint and tea, drifted toward me. Like this, she murmured, guiding the pen in my hand. Her fingers wrapped lightly around mine, steadying, correcting. The touch was meant to be professional, but it carried a weight neither of us could deny. My chest tightened, not from confusion, but from the quiet certainty that this, whatever this was, had grown far beyond lessons. Her hand lingered a second too long. I dared to lift my eyes, and when I did, hers were already waiting for me. The look was brief but unguarded, longing hidden beneath restraint, a spark buried under caution. She blinked quickly, breaking it, pulling her hand back as though the moment had never happened. The silence that followed was louder than any words. I shifted slightly, wanting to speak, to name what neither of us dared, but her posture had changed. She straightened, clasping her hands together on the desk, her eyes fixed firmly on the papers. "You're making progress," she said, her tone returning to the safer distance of teacher and student. Yet the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I smiled faintly, not to mock her words, but because I understood them for what they were, a shield, a wall she was desperately trying to rebuild after letting me glimpse what lay behind it. The room was thick with unspoken words. My pulse echoed in my ears, urging me to close the space, to say something reckless. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let the moment stretch, let it become something neither of us could forget. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than confessions, and sometimes longing grows stronger when left unspoken. And that night, it was silence, heavy, charged, and alive, that told us both the truth. The staff lounge was nearly empty that night, its usual chatter replaced by the hum of an old vending machine and the faint drip of a leaky faucet in the corner. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered softly, casting the room in a pale, uneven glow. She sat across from me at one of the small round tables, her coffee untouched, fingers curled tightly around the mug as though it were her anchor. "I've been thinking," she said finally, breaking the stillness. Her voice was quiet, but each word carried the weight of a decision already rehearsed. "Maybe these sessions should stop." The words hit harder than I expected. For a moment, the only sound was the buzz of electricity running through the ceiling lights. My chest tightened, and I searched her face, the weariness in her eyes, the tension etched at the corners of her mouth. This wasn't about my grades anymore. This was about the line we were both towing. "You're afraid," I said gently. Her eyes flicked up to mine, startled, as if I had spoken the thought she hadn't dared to name. She tried to smile, but it faltered. "Of course I'm afraid," she admitted, her hands tightening around the mug. "I'm your teacher. I'm supposed to guide you, not," she stopped herself, the unfinished sentence hanging between us like a fragile truth she couldn't bear to complete. I leaned forward, my hands resting flat on the table, careful not to touch hers yet. I don't come here because I expect you to make things easier. I come here because I respect you. Because you make me want to be better, not just in class, but in everything. Her breath caught, just faintly, but enough for me to notice. The wall she had been building, brick by brick, trembled under the weight of those words. She blinked quickly, and for the first time, I saw her eyes glisten. She lowered her gaze, and I reached out, hesitating only a second before brushing my thumb gently across her cheek where a tear had escaped. Her skin was warm beneath my touch, softer than I imagined, and instead of pulling away, she let me linger there. Her lips parted as if to protest, but the sound never came. Her shoulders relaxed, the tension seeping from her frame, leaving her looking not like the untouchable teacher, but like a woman who had carried too much for too long. In that fragile moment, trust replaced fear. Not spoken, not declared, but understood, in the space where my hand met her skin, in the silence where words dared not tread. The final evening came quietly, without ceremony. Exams were finished, papers stacked neatly in her satchel, the last remnants of chalk dust brushed from the board. The building was nearly empty, the corridors hushed, and the classroom bathed in the fading glow of twilight. I lingered by my desk, uncertain if this night would feel like an ending or the beginning of something neither of us could name. She stood by the window, the sky behind her streaked with orange and violet, casting her silhouette in gentle contrast. Her posture was calm, yet there was a stillness about her that felt heavier than usual. She turned, and for the first time, her expression carried no mask of authority, only quiet weariness and something softer, unguarded. "You passed," she said simply, her voice steady but low. She set the graded paper on the desk in front of me, her fingers brushing the edge for a moment longer than necessary. "Not just the exam. You've done more than I thought you could." The words carried no lecture, no guarded tone, only pride laced with something deeper. I looked up, meeting her gaze, and saw the faintest smile tug at her lips. It wasn't the smile of a teacher rewarding a student. It was personal, warm, almost fragile. "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. She shook her head gently, stepping closer. "You wanted it. You worked for it. All I did was stand beside you." The space between us dissolved as she stopped just a breath away. The silence was thick, not with fear this time, but with a tenderness that had been waiting to surface. I felt my pulse race, not from doubt, but from the certainty of what lingered in her eyes. Slowly, almost cautiously, she leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against my chest. The contact was so simple, yet it sent warmth flooding through me. My arms lifted, circling her gently, not pulling, not demanding, just holding. She exhaled against me, a soft sigh that carried months of restraint unraveling all at once. We stood there in the twilight, no words exchanged, no promises spoken. Just the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat against mine and the knowledge that whatever lines had once kept us apart had blurred into something deeper, something chosen. Outside, cicadas hummed in the trees, their song marking the end of one season and the beginning of another. And in that still classroom, I realized we had both passed a test far greater than any exam.